For 600 years, the Ottoman Empire ruled with unmatched power. But hidden beneath the glory was a darkness so vile, the scribes refused to write it. Conquered kings were executed, their lands swallowed, but their wives, their families, faced a punishment so cruel, even the victors dared not record it. It was a horror whispered only in shadows, a silence more terrifying than blood on the battlefield. Because when an empire chooses to erase its own deeds, you know the truth is far darker than history will ever admit. Tonight, that truth is no longer hidden. Tonight, you will see the punishment the Ottomans never wanted the world to know. The Ottoman Empire stretched across continents like a shadow that refused to fade. From the deserts of Arabia to the mountains of the Balkans, its armies marched with banners soaked in both glory and fear. Historians often describe the empire as a cradle of civilization, of architecture, culture, and law. But what they rarely mention is the system of power that thrived not just on conquest but on silence. It began in villages along the empire's expanding frontiers. For every battle fought, there was a trail of ashes left behind, villages reduced to dust, families torn apart. The soldiers of the Sultan carried not only swords, but an unspoken code. What was taken belonged to the empire, and what was destroyed was never to be remembered. In this silence, countless lives vanished into the margins of history. Among those who suffered most were the women of the defeated. They were not simply victims of war. They were tools, symbols, and warnings. The Ottomans knew that to break a people, you did not only kill their warriors, you crushed their families. And so, the wives of fallen enemies became invisible prisoners of power. Some were sent to distant harems, where their names were erased and their identities reshaped. Others faced punishments whispered about but never recorded, as if even the ink itself recoiled at the horror. The empire's scribes carefully chronicled victories, architecture, and laws, but their silence on these punishments speaks louder than words. In palaces adorned with marble and gold, decisions were made that shaped the fate of thousands, yet not a single line was spared for the screams that echoed behind closed doors. This absence was deliberate. The Ottomans were masters of image, and cruelty had to remain hidden to preserve the facade of divine order. Imagine a conquered city, the gates broken, the defenders slaughtered, and the streets soaked in despair. The men who resisted were often executed publicly, their deaths serving as a warning. But their wives, left standing in the aftermath, were not executed. Their fate was worse. They became a living reminder of defeat, bound not by chains of iron but by chains of shame and fear. To the victors, their existence was a weapon, a way to humiliate entire generations. The silence surrounding their suffering was not accidental. It was systemic. Families of the conquered were scattered, children absorbed into the janissary system, mothers forced into servitude or worse. And yet these events were hidden beneath layers of official history, painted over with stories of tolerance and order. But behind that veil of civilization was a darkness that only the victims truly knew. As the empire expanded, these hidden injustices multiplied. For the Ottomans, conquest was not just about land. It was about control. Control of memory, control of legacy, control of truth itself. They could rewrite laws, redraw maps, even erase bloodlines. What they could not erase was the echo of suffering, carried in whispers that survived long after the empire itself had crumbled. This is the story of those whispers, of the silenced wives whose punishments were too cruel for paper and ink, of families dismantled not for what they had done, but for who they were, and of an empire that built its glory not only on victory, but on carefully buried shadows. In the heart of the empire, in the opulent palaces of Istanbul, the line between power and cruelty was razor thin. The sultans sat upon gilded thrones, their eyes distant yet calculating, weighing the cost of every conquest. They were men who understood that fear could be as potent as any army, and that punishment, when hidden in plain sight, became immortal. Beyond the palace gates, ordinary lives were twisted by the shadow of Ottoman justice. The wives of defeated warriors were forced into impossible choices, obedience or despair. Their days became a prison of monotony and terror, their nights haunted by the memories of what had been lost. Families that had once stood proud were now fragmented, scattered across the empire like broken pieces of a puzzle that could never be reassembled. Some women were taken into harems far from home, their identities stripped and rewritten. Languages were lost, names were changed, and heritage was erased. In these isolated quarters, they became trophies, objects of possession rather than human beings. But even this calculated cruelty was not enough to satisfy the mechanisms of control the empire demanded. For some, there were punishments that were whispered of in terror, rituals designed to humiliate, isolate, and break the spirit entirely. The empire's chroniclers avoided such stories. If ink were to touch these horrors, it might stain the grand narrative of conquest. Yet these hidden punishments were the backbone of Ottoman dominance, a quiet terror that reinforced power without public spectacle. Where the battlefield delivered visible death, the empire's hidden chambers delivered invisible suffering, leaving scars that no historian dared record. In remote provinces, where the grip of Istanbul was tightest, the consequences of rebellion or defeat were most pronounced. Entire villages that had resisted Ottoman expansion became silent testimonies to the consequences of defiance. Men were executed, property confiscated, and women taken into servitude. Mothers watched their sons disappear into the Janissary Corps, children raised to serve a regime that had destroyed their families. Even when these women survived physically, their lives were haunted by loss, fear, and the knowledge that the world would never see their suffering. And yet, these hidden torments had a strange power. They forced obedience not just through fear of death, but through the terror of erasure. The Ottoman Empire understood that control over memory could be as devastating as control over armies. By erasing names, rewriting identities, and dispersing families, the empire ensured that its dominion extended beyond the physical and into the very consciousness of its subjects. Stories of bravery and rebellion were rare, but they did exist. Whispered legends spoke of women who resisted the cruel fates imposed upon them, who defied captivity and preserved fragments of their identity. Yet even these stories were incomplete, fragmented by the silencing that surrounded them. Each tale of resistance was a flickering candle in the vast darkness of oppression, barely illuminating the horrors that the empire's official records would never admit. The fear that the empire cultivated was total. It was not simply fear of punishment, but fear of being erased from history. In this context, cruelty became a tool of strategy. The most terrifying acts were those hidden from sight, those punished in secrecy, leaving survivors to carry the burden of memory alone. And in this silence, the empire thrived, its power unchallenged, its shadow stretching across centuries. Even today, the whispers remain, echoes of women who endured, who suffered, and whose stories were deliberately silenced. Their lives, their torment, and their courage were the true currency of an empire that valued appearance over truth. Understanding this is crucial, for only by acknowledging the hidden pain can one truly comprehend the price of conquest. The deeper one delved into the empire's inner workings, the more the line between governance and terror blurred. Governors in distant provinces enforced the Sultan's will with a precision that was both admired and feared. Their task was simple: maintain order. But the methods were anything but simple. Rebellion was met not only with death, but with a systematic destruction of identity. Families were torn apart, communities reshaped, and women were the silent bearers of this punishment, their suffering invisible to the world. In one small village along the edge of Anatolia, a widow named Layla became the unwitting symbol of Ottoman cruelty. Her husband had fallen defending their town against invading forces, and while the men of the village were executed or enslaved, Layla was taken to the provincial governor's estate. There she was forced into servitude, her daily life a relentless series of humiliations designed to crush both body and spirit. Every glance, every whispered command reminded her that she was no longer her own, that her existence belonged entirely to the empire. Layla's story was far from unique. Across the empire, women like her endured fates that were carefully concealed by layers of bureaucracy and tradition. Empire's chroniclers rarely mentioned them, and when they did, it was in vague terms: captives or servants, words that stripped away the depth of human suffering. But the truth was undeniable. These women were punished not for crimes, but for being the extensions of men who dared defy the Ottoman rule. Their punishment was total, encompassing not only freedom but identity, dignity, and even memory itself. In the harems of Istanbul, the scale of control was even more absolute. Women taken from conquered lands were isolated from their families, their languages and customs systematically erased. Some were trained to serve the Sultan or his officials, Others were used as bargaining chips in political negotiations, their lives subjected to the whims of power. And yet, the empire ensured that none of this entered the official record. If a chronicler ever attempted to write of these horrors, they were reminded that silence was the greater safeguard of history. But this silence created its own form of power. For those who survived, fear became internalized, a constant companion. Every word spoken, every action taken was measured against the invisible threat of punishment. The empire's greatest weapon was not always the sword. It was the knowledge that history itself could be turned against you, that to resist was not only dangerous, but possibly erase your very existence from memory. Layla, like many others, found small ways to resist. A song whispered in secret, a memory preserved in a hidden corner of her mind, became acts of defiance. These acts were insignificant in the eyes of the empire, yet monumental in the struggle for personal survival. Every day that passed without surrendering entirely to despair was a small victory, a way to reclaim a fraction of humanity that the empire sought to consume. As centuries passed, these hidden injustices accumulated into a vast, silent history, a narrative written not in ink, but in fear, suffering, and resilience. The empire's power depended on it remaining invisible, and yet, the echoes of these stories persisted, carried in the lives of the oppressed, passed down through generations, challenging the official narrative that celebrated conquest while hiding cruelty. It is in these shadows, in the silences between the lines of history, that the true nature of the Ottoman Empire emerges, not only as a conqueror of lands, but as a master of control, fear, and hidden punishment. Understanding this is the first step to comprehending the human cost of an empire that ruled for 6 centuries. The city of Istanbul gleamed like a jewel atop the Bosphorus, but beneath the surface, its beauty concealed countless stories of suffering. The Sultan's power was absolute, yet it was exercised not only through armies, but through a meticulously constructed hierarchy of fear. Every decree, every punishment, every hidden act of cruelty reinforced a system in which survival required both obedience and silence. In this vast empire, the lives of the defeated were rarely theirs to command. Conquered women, removed from their homes and families, became instruments of control. They were trained, coerced, and sometimes destroyed, all in the name of maintaining order. And yet, even in their suffering, whispers of defiance persisted. Some hid fragments of their culture, small acts of remembrance that became acts of rebellion in themselves. Songs, prayers, stories passed down from mother to daughter. They were invisible weapons against the empire's relentless attempt to erase identity. Far from the grand palaces, in provinces where the Sultan's reach was less visible but no less firm, the human cost of conquest was stark. Entire villages vanished, and survivors were scattered or absorbed into servitude. The women left behind endured a fate neither death nor liberty could describe. Their lives were a constant negotiation with fear, their choices limited to submission or obliteration. And yet within these constraints, courage persisted. Some learned to survive by becoming invisible, blending into the machinery of the empire without losing the core of who they were. One woman, Fatima, had been taken from her home in the Balkans after her husband was executed for resisting the Sultan's forces. She was placed in a distant provincial estate, tasked with menial labor under the watchful eye of the governor's officers. Each day was a ritual of humiliation designed to strip her of dignity. Yet she resisted silently, preserving her memories, her language, her identity in secret. In her small acts of defiance, Fatima represented countless women whose stories were intentionally buried, their suffering unrecorded by history. The empire's chroniclers painted a different picture, one of justice, culture, and divine order. But in reality, power was maintained through the careful balance of visibility and secrecy. Public executions, military victories, and grand architecture were displayed to impress and intimidate. Hidden punishments, suffered in isolation, were the unseen gears that ensured obedience and perpetuated fear. The women of conquered lands were both victims and symbols, a living testament to the cost of resistance. Even within the Sultan's harems, where life seemed luxurious to an outsider, cruelty was an omnipresent shadow. Women were often pitted against one another, their loyalty tested, their identities reshaped to serve political or personal agendas. Their bodies, minds, and memories became tools in the empire's pursuit of absolute control. And still, the world outside remained largely unaware. These stories, when they surfaced at all, were muted, described in vague terms that concealed the magnitude of suffering endured. The empire's power extended beyond the physical. By erasing voices, histories, and identities, it controlled perception itself. To be unseen was often as terrifying as to be imprisoned. Women learned that survival required more than obedience. It demanded invisibility, cunning, and the quiet preservation of self amidst the machinery of domination. Fatima's survival was a fragile thread stretched across fear, memory, and quiet rebellion. In the darkness of her confinement, she whispered the songs of her homeland, passed down by her mother, keeping alive a culture the empire sought to erase. These whispers were dangerous. Discovery could lead to punishment far worse than death. Yet the act of remembering became a lifeline, a small assertion of humanity in a world determined to strip it away. Across the empire, countless women lived in similar shadows. They were removed from families, forced into servitude, stripped of names and histories, yet their resilience persisted in small, imperceptible ways. Each retained fragment of their past became a secret weapon, a personal rebellion against the relentless machinery of conquest. In the official annals, their suffering was invisible. In reality, it formed the silent backbone of the empire's control. The psychological weight of this hidden oppression was immense. Women learned to navigate spaces where every glance, every misstep, could bring ruin. They measured words, hid expressions, and endured isolation. Each act of survival became a testament to endurance, a quiet defiance that history would never record. The empire's chroniclers celebrated victories on the battlefield, but failed to acknowledge the cost of maintaining power behind closed doors. In the provinces, governors exercised authority through fear, systematically dismantling the social structures of conquered communities. Men who resisted were executed, families dispersed, and women left to endure both labor and humiliation. Fatima witnessed her neighbors vanish, her friends assimilated or destroyed, and yet she persisted. Her memories became a secret archive, a way to preserve identity amidst forced erasure. Every day of survival was a rebellion against the empire's attempt to rewrite existence itself. The empire's strategy extended far beyond immediate punishment. By controlling memory, the Ottomans created a society where fear was internalized. Those who survived were haunted not only by past trauma, but by the invisible threat of continued oppression. Women like Fatima were trapped in a system where resistance and visibility could be deadly, yet invisibility meant a life of isolation, silence, and constant vigilance. This duality became the essence of survival, shaping not only individual lives but entire generations. Even in the palaces, where luxury masked cruelty, women became both pawns and witnesses to injustice. Rivalries were manufactured, obedience enforced, and identities manipulated to serve the political and personal ambitions of those in power. Yet these acts of manipulation and domination were rarely recorded, and when they were cloaked in euphemism. The reality of pain, suffering, and psychological torment remained hidden, preserved only in the lived experiences of those who endured it. It was in these shadows that courage manifested most profoundly. Small acts of remembrance, subtle defiance, and the maintenance of cultural identity became quiet forms of resistance. Women like Fatima, despite isolation and fear, nurtured the fragile threads of their heritage. They ensured that even in a world designed to erase them, traces of identity persisted, whispers of humanity that refused to be silenced. By understanding these hidden injustices, the true cost of the Ottoman Empire's expansion becomes evident. Conquest was not only a matter of armies and territory, it was a methodical system of control, fear, and erasure. Women bore the weight of this system, their suffering invisible yet central to the empire's enduring power. Their lives illuminate a dark reality, often glossed over in history books, revealing the profound human toll that accompanied centuries of rule. Fatima's story, though harrowing, was also a story of resilience. It illustrates how individuals, even under the most oppressive circumstances, find ways to preserve their humanity. By holding onto memory, identity, and small acts of defiance, they resisted the empire's attempt to erase them entirely. And in doing so, they created a legacy that whispers across time, challenging the sanitized narratives of history. and exposing the hidden horrors that official records omit. As the sun set over Istanbul, the grandeur of the empire's skyline belied the silent suffering within. For every victory celebrated in gold and marble, countless stories like Fatima's remained untold. Yet these stories, hidden though they may be, form the true texture of history. A history not only of conquest but of survival, courage, and the unyielding human spirit that refuses to be erased. And so as we move toward the rising tide of conflict and revelation, it is essential to remember that the Ottoman Empire's power was built not only on armies, but on the carefully concealed suffering of the innocent. The lives of women, erased from official memory, form the hidden backbone of this dark legacy, one that will shape the unfolding story and lead inexorably to the moments of injustice, revelation, and climax yet to come. The empire's shadow reached far and wide, touching every corner of the conquered lands. Villages that had once thrived were now ghost towns, their streets silent except for the occasional whisper of memory. Families torn apart by the Sultan's armies had their women sent into isolation or servitude, their men executed or enslaved, their children absorbed into the janissary system. Yet the silence that followed was as deliberate as the conquest itself. Those who survived understood that fear was not just a tool, it was the foundation of power. Fatima's days had grown longer and more torturous. The routines imposed upon her were designed to erase her identity, to make her forget who she had been. She was instructed in the language of the empire, forbidden to speak her own tongue. Her memories of her homeland were a secret rebellion, but each whisper of a song or hidden remembrance was a dangerous gamble. If discovered, it could mean further punishment or even death. Still, she clung to these fragments of the past, understanding that memory was her last weapon against the empire's relentless machinery. In the provincial estates, other women faced similar fates. Some were forced into domestic labor, others used as tools of negotiation between powerful men. They became symbols of victory, trophies whose suffering reinforced the omnipresent reach of the Sultan's authority. In these acts of domination, cruelty was measured not by visibility but by subtlety. Public executions taught fear of death. Hidden punishments taught fear of erasure, of a life stripped of dignity and identity. The empire's control extended beyond the physical. Psychological terror was woven into every interaction. Women learned to navigate spaces where a wrong glance, a misplaced word, or a remembered custom could invoke punishment. Each act of survival required vigilance, creativity, and restraint. Even obedience was a performance, masking the inner defiance that preserved fragments of culture and identity. Survival was not simply living, it was a constant negotiation with an invisible oppressor. Word of resistance traveled in whispers. Some women, despite isolation and fear, found ways to aid one another. Hidden gestures, secret messages, and shared memories became lifelines. Though these acts were small, they represented a challenge to the empire's goal of total erasure. Each preserved song, each concealed tradition, became an act of defiance, a spark of human resilience in a system designed to extinguish it. But the empire was aware of the danger of cohesion among the oppressed. Even within harems and provincial estates, divisions were created to prevent solidarity. Rivalries were manufactured, allegiances manipulated, and loyalty tested. Women became both prisoners and instruments of control over one another. Trust was a scarce commodity, yet necessary for survival. Fatima learned to navigate these treacherous waters, balancing caution with the desperate need to hold on to humanity. The empire's architects of fear understood that the most effective control was invisible. The threat was omnipresent yet elusive, like a shadow in the corner of the eye. Punishments inflicted behind closed doors, humiliations carried out in secret, they ensured compliance without public spectacle. And for those who witnessed them, the terror was amplified by isolation. Fear became internalized, creating a population obedient not from direct coercion, but from anticipation of what might happen if they disobeyed. In the marketplaces and streets, the signs of conquest were everywhere. Empty homes, confiscated lands, and silent families spoke louder than any proclamation. Yet the empire maintained the appearance of order and prosperity. Foreign diplomats, merchants, and travelers saw the grandeur of Istanbul, the efficiency of governance, the majesty of architecture. They did not see the countless women whose lives had been broken in silence, whose suffering was deliberately hidden to preserve the empire's image. Amid this sprawling network of control, small acts of rebellion persisted. Women like Fatima memorized stories of their past, retold them in whispers, and passed them to the next generation. Songs, prayers, and rituals became coded messages of resistance. These acts were not grand. They could not topple armies, but they were essential for the preservation of identity and culture in a world that sought to erase it. The empire could conquer lands, but the human spirit remained defiant in ways that were subtle, persistent, and dangerous to the oppressor. As months and years passed, the stakes grew higher. Any sign of resistance could provoke retaliation. Women endured relentless psychological pressure, isolation, and the constant fear of punishment. The empire's machinery was efficient, precise, and merciless. And yet, for every act of cruelty imposed, there were hidden acts of courage, resilience, and survival. These opposing forces created a tension that was impossible to ignore, a pressure cooker of fear, defiance, and the simmering potential for revolt. The shadows of the past converged with the present as the empire expanded further. New territories brought new victims, new acts of cruelty, and new women trapped in cycles of oppression. Fatima observed newcomers arriving at the estates, girls who still believed in freedom, women who had not yet learned to mask their identities. Their naivete reminded her of the stakes, of the cost of survival, and the importance of preserving knowledge, memory, and courage. Each arrival was a test, both of the empire's power and of the human capacity to endure under unimaginable pressure. And in the quiet corners of the estates, where no scribe would record, whispers of injustice persisted. Every secret remembered was an act of rebellion, every hidden tear a testament to resilience. Fatima, like countless others, became a living archive of suffering, courage, and defiance. Her story, though invisible to the world, carried the weight of generations and the quiet hope that one day the truth would surface. The months stretched into years, and the empire's grip tightened, like a vice around the lives of the conquered. Fatima's world was a series of routines, carefully orchestrated to enforce obedience, yet beneath each act lay a tension that refused to be extinguished. Every command, every glance from an overseer carried a silent threat, a reminder that even survival was conditional. The line between life and suffering was narrow, yet it was all that remained for those whose identities had been systematically erased. In the provincial estates, new forms of cruelty emerged. Some women were forced into roles that pitted them against one another, creating rivalries and distrust. Even the smallest error could invoke punishment, a reminder that survival required constant vigilance. Fatima observed the newcomers, women who still carried the spark of defiance in their eyes. She realized that if these embers could be nurtured, if whispered lessons from the past could be passed on, then perhaps some fragment of resistance might endure beyond the confines of the empire's oppression. The psychological weight of captivity deepened as the empire extended its influence. Fear was no longer only about physical punishment. It was about the erasure of self. Women were stripped of their names, their languages, their customs. Each forced act of obedience was a calculated erosion of identity. Yet in these acts of quiet defiance, songs sung in secret, memories shared in whispers, survival became more than endurance. It became a form of resistance. Word of atrocities spread slowly, carried by those who had survived encounters with the Sultan's justice. Families warned one another in hushed tones, sharing knowledge of punishments too cruel for official records. These whispers became a hidden network of intelligence, a way to anticipate the empire's reach and navigate its dangers. Fatima became part of this web, passing along fragments of memory, fragments of warning, and fragments of hope. Each act of communication, no matter how subtle, was a rebellion against the empire's attempt to dominate history itself. Even within the grand halls of Istanbul, cruelty remained hidden beneath luxury and ceremony. The Sultan's advisors, governors, and eunuchs wielded power in ways that were invisible to the outside world. Women who arrived from distant provinces were molded into instruments of control, their identities rewritten to suit political needs. Rivalries, manipulations, and carefully enforced hierarchies ensured that solidarity remained impossible. Trust was dangerous yet essential, and those who learned to navigate this terrain became the unseen resistance, preserving culture and identity against the tide of erasure. As Fatima matured under these pressures, her defiance took on new forms. She observed patterns, learned the methods of control, and discovered small opportunities to subvert them. A hidden song here, a coded gesture there. Each small act of rebellion was a statement of survival and courage. Though invisible to the empire, these acts held immense personal significance, preserving the threads of identity and memory that the empire sought to destroy. The broader empire continued to expand, and with each conquest came new victims, new layers of oppression and new opportunities for resistance. Women arrived at the estates, unaware of the full extent of what awaited them. Fatima recognized herself in them, their fear, their hope, and their determination to survive. She became a silent guide, teaching survival without revealing the full horror, instilling courage while preparing them for the relentless machinery of domination. In the marketplaces, streets, and courts of the empire, the signs of conquest were subtle but pervasive. Land confiscated, families broken, traditions suppressed. The empire's reach extended into the very fabric of daily life. Observers, both foreign and domestic, marveled at the order, the architecture, and the discipline, yet they could not perceive the silent suffering that sustained it. The real story of the empire existed not in its monuments or decrees, but in the hidden corridors where women endured, resisted, and survived. The psychological tension within the estates reached a breaking point. Any misstep, any visible act of defiance could provoke retaliation. Yet for every instance of cruelty, there were parallel acts of courage, teaching, and preservation of culture. Fatima's leadership in subtle rebellion inspired others. She became an invisible mentor, her actions shaping a hidden network of resistance that quietly undermined the empire's attempt to erase identity. As the years wore on, the stakes escalated. Punishments grew more severe, strategies of control more sophisticated, and the ever-present fear of erasure intensified. Yet within this environment of oppression, resilience thrived. The women of the empire, though constrained, discovered ways to retain dignity, preserve memory, and nurture hope. Their lives became a testament to the human spirit's capacity to endure, to resist, and to survive. Even under the most systematic and invisible forms of cruelty, the weight of silence hung heavily over every corridor, every estate, every village within the Ottoman Empire. Fatima had learned to navigate this oppressive landscape with caution, yet her awareness of the empire's cruelty only grew sharper. She had seen women arrive full of hope and leave as shadows of themselves, and each story etched deeper into her understanding of the mechanisms of power. Invisibility was survival, but it came at the cost of constant vigilance, and the empire's architects of fear knew exactly how to exploit that. As the empire expanded further into new territories, the network of control became increasingly sophisticated. Governors and overseers implemented rules that were meticulously designed to erase identity while maintaining order. Punishments became more psychologically intricate. Isolations that lasted months, enforced rivalries, coerced betrayals. Each act of compliance was a test, each failure a potential doom. The women within this system learned quickly. Trust was dangerous yet essential. Defiance was perilous, yet necessary to preserve a sense of self. Fatima observed a new wave of arrivals from the Balkans, their eyes bright with naive hope. She recognized their fear, their confusion, and their quiet resistance. She began to guide them subtly, teaching them the unspoken rules of survival, passing down fragments of her culture, songs and stories hidden in the smallest gestures. In this hidden network, the women became a quiet rebellion, an invisible force against the empire's relentless attempt to erase them. Yet the empire was never static. Surveillance was constant, and rumors of resistance were punished severely. Women who had attempted to hide their identities, to preserve pieces of their heritage, were often caught and punished in ways too cruel to be recorded. The fear of discovery was omnipresent, shaping every word, every glance, every act. It was a psychological crucible that forged endurance and cunning in those who survived. In Istanbul, the palace corridors held their own shadows. Power was exercised with a precision that left no trace of mercy. Women were not merely confined, they were manipulated, observed, and tested. Every action could be interpreted as loyalty or defiance, and the consequences were severe. The lessons of survival that Fatima imparted to the newcomers were rooted in this understanding. Knowledge of the empire's methods could be a shield. Culture could be a weapon. and memory could be armor against the erasure of self. The tension reached a point where every day was a delicate balance. Even minor acts such as a whispered song or a concealed gesture were loaded with risk. But for Fatima and those who shared her resolve, these acts were essential. They maintained a connection to a past that the empire sought to obliterate and forged a fragile but unbreakable thread of resistance. The women learned that survival was not merely physical, it was cultural, psychological, and spiritual. The shadow of oppression extended into every interaction, every space. Women had to anticipate the empire's reach and adapt. Constantly, Fatima became adept at reading intentions, at sensing danger before it arrived. Her leadership within the hidden network grew, and with it, the sense that even in the darkest circumstances, agency could be found. Small acts of solidarity, coded communications, and shared memories became the lifeblood of resistance. But the stakes continued to escalate. Punishments became more severe, and the empire's surveillance tightened. A single misstep could result in disappearance or death, and yet the women persisted. Courage manifested in subtle ways, hidden rituals, secret songs, whispered warnings, and these acts were the quiet defiance that sustained hope. Fatima's understanding of these dynamics allowed her to protect the newcomers, while reinforcing the network of survival that had persisted for generations. By the time the empire had consolidated its control over new territories, the women had become experts in subversion. Fatima and others passed down strategies for survival, instilling resilience without attracting the empire's scrutiny. Their acts of resistance were invisible yet powerful, ensuring that even under systematic oppression, fragments of culture, memory, and identity survived. As years passed, the tension became unbearable. Yet it also sharpened the determination of those who endured. The invisible struggle, the fight to preserve memory, identity, and dignity, intensified. The empire's machinery of fear remained relentless, but the women's quiet defiance persisted, ready to erupt when the opportunity arose. Fatima's experiences and leadership created a foundation for what was to come, setting the stage for the ultimate confrontation between hidden courage and systemic cruelty. And so the empire expanded, controlled and silenced, yet within its shadows the seeds of defiance had taken root. Fatima's network of resilience and quiet rebellion became a symbol of the unbreakable human spirit, an invisible testament to those whose suffering was deliberately erased from official history. The tension, the stakes, and the moral complexity of this hidden struggle set the stage for the climactic events that would expose the depth of injustice, the cost of silence, and the power of courage in the face of overwhelming oppression. The shadows of the empire had grown long and oppressive, stretching across lands, families, and histories alike. Fatima's careful strategies of survival, the hidden networks of defiance, and the fragile threads of memory she had preserved were now pushed to their breaking point. The empire's grip had tightened to such an extent that any misstep, any whisper of rebellion, could ignite consequences far beyond comprehension. And yet in the depths of fear, courage found a way to erupt. It began with a subtle act, a song barely audible carried through the corridors of the estate. It was a song from a homeland long erased, a melody that spoke of freedom, loss, and defiance. The overseers failed to notice it, distracted by the routine and bureaucracy of control. But for Fatima and the women who had learned to listen, it was a signal, a spark. The whisper of rebellion, carried in rhythm and memory, ignited a chain reaction that could no longer be contained. Tensions escalated as the women began to act in ways they had never dared before. Hidden glances, coordinated movements, and subtle signals created a rhythm of resistance that the empire could not anticipate. The oppressed became architects of their own agency, challenging the invisible chains that had bound them for years. Every act, though silent and unseen, was a hammer striking against centuries of systematic erasure. Fatima led with quiet determination. She orchestrated acts of defiance that were both daring and precise, ensuring that no unnecessary risk would expose the network too soon. Her leadership transformed fear into strategy and despair into calculated courage. The women, once shadows in the eyes of the empire, now became a force of calculated subversion, their unity hidden yet formidable. The empire, confident in its control, could not perceive the magnitude of what was unfolding. The mechanisms of fear that had maintained compliance for decades were suddenly undermined by ingenuity, memory, and human will. In every corridor, in every hidden room, the women moved with silent purpose, carrying messages, preserving rituals, and reclaiming fragments of identity. These actions, invisible to the empire's record keepers, carried a power that no sword could suppress. As the tension reached its peak, the psychological weight of the empire clashed with the unyielding human spirit. Overseers noticed small disruptions, subtle signs that obedience was no longer guaranteed. Yet they could not trace the source. Fatima's careful orchestration ensured that the spark of rebellion spread without detection, like roots growing beneath the surface of a frozen river, unseen but unstoppable. The stakes escalated further when the arrival of a high-ranking official threatened to expose the network. Every woman knew that discovery meant torture, death, or disappearance. But instead of retreating, they intensified their efforts. Courage, sharpened by fear, became a weapon. The empire's facade of omnipotence began to crack, revealing that beneath the surface of authority lay vulnerability. The tension in the estate became unbearable. Every step echoed with the potential for discovery, every glance a silent test. Fatima moved like a shadow among shadows, guiding the women with precision, ensuring that their defiance remained unseen yet potent. The whispered songs and hidden messages had transformed into coordinated acts, rituals of memory, subtle sabotage, and defiant gestures that reclaimed fragments of stolen identity. The high-ranking official's visit loomed like a storm cloud. His presence was a reminder of the empire's reach, of the punishment that awaited any deviation from obedience. Yet paradoxically, it was this very threat that fueled the women's courage. Fatima had prepared them for this moment, transforming fear into strategic resolve. Each woman understood her role, each movement calculated to maintain the delicate balance between visibility and resistance. Moments of risk multiplied, yet the women persisted. One hid a forbidden symbol of her homeland, another left a coded message where only the initiated could find it. These small acts, invisible to the official eye, were massive in significance. They were reclaiming power, asserting identity, and proving that memory could not be erased by fear. Fatima herself became the axis of the operation. Her leadership, honed through years of survival and quiet rebellion, turned the oppressive estate into a theater of subtle defiance. Every step, every glance, every whispered word was part of a larger design, a network of resistance so precise that even under the empire's scrutiny, it remained undetected. Yet the psychological strain was immense. The constant vigilance, the fear of betrayal, the awareness that discovery could annihilate them all, created a tension that was almost unbearable. But in that crucible of fear, courage crystallized. The women understood that this was the moment their resilience would be tested. And in doing so, they became more than victims. They became architects of their own liberation, even if only within the confines of the estate. The official's inspection began. He moved through the halls with a measured gaze, inspecting compliance, noting obedience, yet oblivious to the subtle defiance interwoven in every corner. Fatima watched, heart pounding, as small acts of rebellion unfolded seamlessly around him. Her song hummed quietly in the background. Coded gestures passed between women, hidden symbols subtly displayed, all invisible to the empire's power, yet profoundly significant. Time itself seemed to stretch. Every second was fraught with danger, every movement a test of nerve, yet the network persisted, resilient and undeterred. The psychological stakes were higher than ever, but the women's determination matched them. They had endured years of oppression, witnessed countless injustices, and yet they had survived. Now their defiance was no longer quiet. It was strategic, purposeful, and unstoppable. As the inspection neared its end, a final act of subtle rebellion crystallized. Fatima orchestrated a moment so calculated that it conveyed a message of hope, resilience, and unbroken identity, without attracting the officials' notice. It was a triumph of human spirit over systematic oppression, a testament to endurance, courage, and the refusal to be erased. The air was thick with tension, each breath a reminder of the stakes. Fatima moved with a purpose that belied the fear gnawing at her. Every glance calculated, every step precise. Around her, the women carried out the final elements of their subtle rebellion. Gestures, songs, coded messages, all perfectly synchronized. It was as though the very walls of the estate had absorbed the memory of suffering and transformed it into a force of resilience. The high-ranking official, oblivious to the hidden defiance around him, praised obedience and compliance, unaware that every act he lauded was a carefully choreographed illusion. Fatima's orchestration had turned fear into strategy, despair into coordination, and invisibility into a shield. Each woman played her part, not just to survive, but to assert a quiet, unyielding humanity that the empire had tried to erase. In that crucible of oppression, moments of courage became monumental. Fatima's network, invisible yet formidable, had reclaimed fragments of identity stolen over years. Memories, traditions, and whispered stories flowed silently among the women, preserving culture and defiance alike. It was a rebellion waged without swords or armies, yet it held more power than any battle the empire could claim. The climax of this hidden struggle reached its peak as the official departed, satisfied with the appearance of obedience. The estate returned to silence, but the victory was palpable. The women, led by Fatima, had endured, resisted, and emerged unbroken. Their courage had illuminated a path through oppression, a proof that identity, memory, and spirit could survive even in the darkest shadows of an empire. In that final moment, the magnitude of what they had accomplished became clear. Years of oppression, fear, and erasure had met with strategy, solidarity, and resilience. The empire's machinery had been challenged, not with force, but with the unyielding persistence of human spirit. Fatima's leadership had transformed fear into empowerment, silence into coded defiance, and despair into hope. And yet, the story did not end with the official's departure. The seeds of rebellion planted within the estate would continue to grow, carried in memory, song, and action, spreading beyond the walls that had tried to contain them. The hidden network of women had proven that even in a world designed to erase them, identity, courage, and humanity could not be extinguished. The empire's power, though vast, was not absolute. Its ability to control was limited by the resilience of those it sought to dominate. Fatima's story, along with countless untold stories, became a living testament to endurance, defiance, and the unbreakable human spirit. The climax was not merely a confrontation, it was a revelation that even under systematic oppression, survival could be an act of rebellion, and courage a weapon against the erasure of history itself. The echoes of the empire's control still lingered, long after the official had departed and the shadows of oppression had shifted. Fatima and the women she had guided were no longer mere survivors. They had become bearers of memory, guardians of identity, and symbols of resilience. The acts of defiance that had begun in whispers now resonated within the silent walls of the estate, each song, gesture, and hidden message a testament to their courage. The years of fear and subjugation had left indelible marks, yet they had also forged strength. Fatima walked through the corridors that had once seemed like prisons, now carrying the quiet pride of victory. Her network of women had endured, preserving fragments of their culture, their heritage, and their humanity. Each step she took was a reminder that even under the empire's crushing weight, the spirit could survive and even thrive. Outside the walls, the empire continued to expand, unconcerned with the quiet resistance that persisted in its shadows. Villages had been conquered, traditions suppressed, and countless lives erased from the official record. But the women within these estates, guided by Fatima's foresight, carried within them an unbroken chain of memory, a hidden archive of culture that the empire could never claim. Their defiance was invisible yet unassailable, a living proof that identity could not be extinguished by fear or coercion. The psychological impact of years under such relentless oppression was profound. Fatima herself bore scars that were invisible to the eye, memories of fear that lingered in quiet moments. Yet within her, and within those she had mentored, lay a resilience that transformed trauma into strength. Each act of rebellion, no matter how subtle, had preserved not only culture, but the essential humanity of those who had been targeted for erasure. As time passed, the women's hidden victories accumulated into a network of resilience that extended beyond the estate. Stories of courage and endurance traveled through secret channels, whispered from one survivor to another, creating bonds that no empire could sever. The knowledge of survival became a legacy, teaching future generations the power of memory, identity, and subtle defiance. Fatima reflected on the price that had been paid. Countless lives had been shattered, families torn apart and identities suppressed. Yet within this sorrow there was a profound lesson. The human spirit, when pushed to its limits, could not be destroyed. Acts of courage, even when unseen and unrecorded, carried immense significance. They preserved culture, history, and the essence of humanity against systematic attempts at erasure. The quiet triumph of these women was a form of revolution. It did not involve armies, battles, or public spectacle. Instead, it relied on the endurance of memory, the subtlety of coded acts, and the persistence of identity. The empire's strength, vast as it was, had limits. Fear could control bodies, but it could not conquer the mind, the soul, or the legacy of culture carried within the oppressed. Fatima understood that the true power of the empire was in the stories it erased, the silences it enforced, and the control it wielded over memory. Yet the women's survival demonstrated that the most powerful resistance lay in preserving what the empire could not take: human dignity, culture, and the quiet assertion of identity. Each act of remembrance, each song, and each coded gesture became a weapon against erasure, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. In the aftermath, the women began to reclaim their lives not through public recognition, but through the careful nurturing of identity and culture. They rebuilt rituals, retaught songs, and whispered stories to those who arrived after them. In doing so, they transformed the estate from a site of oppression into a sanctuary of memory and quiet defiance. The legacy of suffering had been transformed into a legacy of resilience. The empire's reach remained vast, but its veneer of control could not touch the inner lives of those who had learned to survive. Fatima walked through the silent halls, now filled with the quiet hum of resilience. Each woman she had guided carried the memory of her lessons, subtle defiance, courage, and the preservation of identity. These lessons became the foundation of a hidden culture, an invisible resistance that no decree or conquest could erase. The psychological scars of years under oppression were still present. Fear lingered, haunting quiet moments and shadowing dreams. Yet these scars were paired with an unyielding strength, a deep understanding that survival required not submission, but strategy, community, and the preservation of humanity. The women had endured atrocities, yet each act of defiance had reinforced their power over their own minds and identities. As the estate returned to its semblance of order, the quiet acts of resistance continued. Songs, whispered histories, and hidden rituals became woven into the fabric of daily life, imperceptible to the empire's gaze. What the empire could not conquer was the essence of humanity preserved in these acts. Fatima understood that the greatest triumph was not in overthrowing the empire with force, but in the persistence of memory, culture, and identity across generations. The broader implications of their survival became clear. The women's resilience challenged the empire's narrative of omnipotence. Where records told of compliance and obedience, the truth was far richer. An intricate network of defiance, courage, and cultural preservation persisted, invisible yet indomitable. Fatima's leadership had shown that even in the most oppressive systems, agency could be reclaimed and identity preserved. Reflection on the cost of survival was unavoidable. Lives had been shattered, innocence lost, and countless women had disappeared into silence. Yet within this sorrow, there existed profound lessons about the limits of power and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Fatima's story, along with those of countless unnamed women, revealed that oppression could never fully extinguish courage, memory, or identity. The empire's architects of fear had failed to account for the resilience of those they sought to erase. Small acts of rebellion, subtle as they were, had created a network of survival and defiance. These acts were a testament to the enduring human spirit and a warning that the most sophisticated machinery of oppression could never completely dominate memory, culture, or identity. In the quiet aftermath, Fatima contemplated the future. Though the empire continued to expand, new generations of women would inherit the lessons of survival, resilience, and cultural preservation. These stories, though hidden from official history, carried the potential to inspire, teach, and preserve identity long after the empire's reach had receded. The legacy of these women became a powerful statement that the human spirit could endure systematic oppression, that memory could outlast erasure, and that courage could manifest in even the smallest, most invisible acts. Through whispered songs, secret stories, and subtle defiance, they had carved out a realm of freedom within the confines of captivity, a freedom the empire could never take. As the sun set over the distant lands controlled by the empire, the echoes of these hidden victories persisted. The empire's grandeur, monuments, and victories recorded in history were immense, but the true measure of resilience was found in the quiet endurance of those whose lives were deliberately erased. Fatima and the women she led embodied this truth, that courage, memory, and identity could survive the most relentless oppression. And so the story concluded not with the fall of an empire, but with the enduring triumph of the human spirit. It was a triumph written not in public records, but in the whispered songs, hidden rituals, and quiet defiance of those who refused to be erased. Their legacy was a reminder, a challenge, and an inspiration, that even in the darkest shadows of history, humanity, courage, and identity could never be extinguished.